There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the space between an athlete's absence and their return. It is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everything being held, questions unanswered, timelines unconfirmed, narratives left half-written by people who weren't in the room. Caitlyn Clark had been living inside that silence for weeks. The injury had pulled her out of the one environment where she operates most naturally. And in that vacuum, the noise had filled in around her the way water fills a space the moment something is removed from it. People debated what the Indiana Fever looked like without her. They debated recovery timelines, roster dependency, whether the whole structure of the franchise had been built too narrowly around one person's presence. She wasn't there to answer any of it, and she didn't try to. What she did instead was come back. And she came back the way she does everything, without announcing it as a moment, without framing it as a comeback story, without giving the narrative what it was waiting for. When she walked into the Lilly-sponsored panel at Final Four FanFest and sat down across from Jaylen Rose in front of a live crowd, the question underneath the entire event was one that nobody had to say out loud. The injury had been real. The time away had been real. And now, here she was, in a room full of people who had watched and waited and wondered. What the crowd got in that next hour wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a carefully managed return statement. It was something considerably rarer, an athlete who had spent weeks being talked about, sitting down and simply talking, not performing composure, not managing perception, just present, direct, and completely herself. The room felt that from the first exchange, and it never let go of it. What followed wasn't a revelation in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was clarity. Most athletes, when asked about their mentors, reach for the obvious answer. A coach who believed in them when no one else did. A veteran teammate who took them aside after practice and said something that changed everything. The story usually has a clean shape. One person, one moment, one lesson that unlocks something. Caitlyn Clark didn't give that answer because that wasn't her story. When Jaylen Rose asked her about the people who shaped her, she went somewhere more specific and more honest than a highlight reel mentorship narrative. She went home. Her father was her first coach, not in the symbolic sense that parents often get credit for the emotional support, the early morning drives to practice, the belief that never wavered. He was literally her coach. He ran practice. He set the standard. He decided when she had done enough and when she hadn't. And then, when practice was over, he sat across from her at dinner. That particular arrangement, living with the person who holds you most accountable, is one of the more psychologically demanding environments a young athlete can develop inside, and Clark was clear that this is exactly where her discipline came from. Not from a speech, not from a single defining moment, from years of a dynamic where excuses had nowhere to land, because the person she would have made them to already knew exactly what had happened and why. What that upbringing produced wasn't just a player with good habits. It produced a person with a specific relationship to accountability that has followed her into every room she has entered since. Clark described it in simple terms at the panel, but the simplicity was the point. It was never basketball first. It was school. It was getting along with her siblings. It was taking care of herself as a complete person before taking care of herself as an athlete. Her father built the foundation not by centering the sport, but by consistently refusing to let the sport become the whole of her identity. That refusal, quiet, daily, repeated across years, is what allowed her to handle the weight of becoming one of the most watched athletes in the country without it pulling her off balance. She arrived at the Indiana Fever already knowing how to separate what she does from who she is. That knowledge didn't come from a sports psychologist or a leadership retreat. It came from a man who coached her hard during the day and passed her the butter at breakfast. There is a version of the college basketball story that gets told about players like Caitlyn Clark, where the institution becomes the hero. The program saw something, developed it, gave it a stage, and launched it into the world. That version isn't entirely wrong, but it flattens something important. Iowa gave Clark a platform. It gave her a coach she described with the kind of quiet certainty you reserve for people whose impact you've had years to measure someone she believes will be in the Hall of Fame one day, stated not as flattery but as simple fact. The program gave her structure, competition, and the specific pressure of being the person every opponent game planned around from her sophomore year onward. But what Iowa couldn't contain, and what became increasingly obvious the longer she played there, was the scale of what she was actually doing to the sport itself. The crowds that started showing up weren't just college basketball crowds. They were people who had found something they hadn't been looking for, a player whose combination of range, instincts, and visible joy on the court made the game feel accessible and electric at the same time. The institution could host that. It couldn't have manufactured it. What Clark took from Iowa wasn't just development in the technical sense. She talked at the panel about her college teammates and captains in a way that revealed something about how she actually learns not from manuals or meetings, but from proximity and observation. The captain she played under showed her that ferocity on the court and genuine care for the people around you aren't competing values. They are the same job, executed simultaneously, and the players who separate themselves are the ones who understand that early enough to act on it. She absorbed that by watching, by being in the same locker room, the same practice, the same difficult stretches of a season where everything was harder than it looked from the outside. Iowa built the competitive architecture. Her teammates filled it with something the program couldn't install, by designing the human texture of what it actually means to lead, without making yourself the center of everything. She arrived in Indianapolis carrying both. The program gave her the stage. The people on it gave her the education that mattered most. There is a category of basketball intelligence that never shows up in a box score. It lives in the half second before a decision gets made. The read, the recognition, the choice that happens so fast, it looks like instinct to everyone watching, but is actually the product of thousands of hours of pattern recognition compressed into something that feels effortless from the outside. Caitlyn Clark operates in that space more consistently than almost any guard in the game right now. And understanding why requires going back further than her college highlight reels. Jaylen Rose made a point at the panel that carried more weight than a casual observation. He remembered watching her pull up from the logo as a sophomore, not as a player trying something reckless, but as a player who had already calculated that the shot was available and that she was the right person to take it. That kind of spatial confidence at 19 doesn't come from being told you're good. It comes from having processed the game at a level deep enough that the court starts to reveal itself to you before the play fully develops. Her father's coaching built the foundation of that processing early, in environments where she had to think rather than just react, where the standard was set high enough that reading the game correctly was the baseline expectation, not the exceptional outcome. What separates Clark's basketball intelligence from players with comparable physical gifts is the way it extends beyond her own actions into the actions of everyone around her. She doesn't just read what the defense is giving her. She reads what her teammates need, what the moment requires, and what the crowd in a particular building is responding to, and she adjusts in real time across all three simultaneously. Rose noted at the panel that she had been living under this kind of elevated pressure and scrutiny since her college years, which means the Indiana fever wasn't a new psychological environment. It was a familiar one in a new city. The cameras, the defensive attention, the weight of being the player, every opposing coach circles on the scouting report. She had already metabolized all of that before she ever played a professional minute. What the WNBA added wasn't pressure she hadn't felt. It was a higher collective baseline of the player she was reading, which forced her processing to sharpen further rather than simply translate. That sharpening is still happening, and the people watching closely enough can see it in the decisions she makes before the broadcast camera has even found the play. Injury in professional sport is never just physical. The body heals on its own timeline, indifferent to schedules and expectations and the noise that builds in the space left behind. But the mind operates on a different timeline entirely, one that doesn't reset simply because the medical staff clears you to return. For Caitlyn Clark, the weeks away from the Indiana fever were defined not by what she was going through physically, but by what was happening in the environment she had temporarily left. The debate around the franchise grew louder the longer she was absent. Questions about roster construction, about whether the team's identity was too narrowly concentrated in one player, about what the 2026 season would look like, depending on when and how she returned. All of it circulated in the way sports media fills a vacuum, confidently and continuously, regardless of what the person at the center of it actually thinks. Clark wasn't available to redirect any of it. She was doing the only thing that has ever made sense to her in difficult stretches, staying in the work, staying in shape through her time with USA Basketball overseas, and refusing to let the noise outside become the noise inside. What she said at the FanFest panel about coming back carried a specific kind of honesty that rehearsed answers don't produce. She described returning to play the way you describe finally eating after skipping meals all day. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just honest about how much she had needed something she hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. That particular admission, quiet and unadorned, told the room more about how she's wired than any statistic could. Tamika Catchings, part of the broader conversation at the event, noted that Clark's time with USA Basketball had kept her in rhythm at a high competition level, meaning the adjustment coming back wasn't about rebuilding fitness. It was about something more nuanced, trusting her teammates to share the load, rather than arriving back and trying to immediately carry everything herself. That distinction matters because it reveals how Clark processes setbacks, not as occasions for heroic individual responses, but as reminders that the structure around her exists for a reason, and that leaning into it is not weakness. It is, in fact, exactly what the weeks away had clarified. The version of an athlete that exists on camera is always a compression. The made shot, the assist, the post-game interview, these are the visible outputs of an invisible infrastructure that most people never see and rarely think about. For Caitlyn Clark, that infrastructure is not complicated or mysterious. It is deliberate, consistent, and built from decisions that are small enough individually to seem unremarkable, but accumulate over time into something that separates her from players with equivalent talent and lesser results. She talked about it at the panel without framing any of it as sacrifice, which is itself revealing. When she mentioned cutting out fast food during her senior year at Iowa, she didn't present it as a difficult choice she had wrestled with, or a turning point that required courage. She presented it as a logical conclusion. The performance level she was targeting required a certain standard of inputs, and fast food didn't meet that standard, so it was gone. No drama attached, no lingering negotiation. That specific quality, the ability to make a significant behavioral change and immediately treat it as simply the new normal, rather than an ongoing act of discipline, is rarer than it sounds and more consequential than it appears in a single anecdote. Hydration was the other habit she returned to, and again the framing was notable. She didn't describe drinking water consistently throughout the day as something she had to remind herself to do or build a system around. She described it as non-negotiable, which is a different relationship to the same behavior. Non-negotiable means the decision has already been made at a level deep enough that it doesn't require daily recommitment. It is simply part of what the day is. Sleep carried the same weight in how she discussed it, not as recovery strategy, but as a performance variable she had learned to take seriously after experiencing concretely and repeatedly how its absence showed up in her body and her game. Rose had his own story about running into her late at night after a big scoring game and reminding her she had class the next morning. That detail matters not because it is surprising, but because it is consistent. The habits she describes publicly are the same ones her coaches and teammates observe privately. There is no gap between the version she presents and the version that shows up at 6 in the morning. That alignment, sustained across years, is where the real work lives in the hours that produce no content, generate no highlights, and exist entirely in service of the moments that do. There is a particular kind of athlete who treats the arrival of success as the moment mentorship ends. They have learned what they needed to learn, absorbed what the people around them had to offer, and now they operate from their own accumulated knowledge outward. Caitlyn Clark is not that athlete, and the way she talked about her Indiana Fever teammates at the FanFest panel made that unmistakably clear. Lexi Hull, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, Sophie Cunningham. She named them the way you name people you are still actively in conversation with, not former influences you have graduated past, but present ones whose example continues to shape how you think about the game and about yourself inside it. That distinction is not semantic. It reflects something genuine about how she positions herself within a locker room that the broader public tends to frame almost entirely around her. The Fever's roster, in the popular narrative, is a supporting cast. In Clark's telling, it is a collection of players. She is still figuring out how to be as good as in the ways that matter most. The quiet leadership, the sustained professionalism, the daily standard that veteran players carry into a building, whether anyone is watching or not. Darren Peterson was on stage for part of the conversation, and what emerged between the two of them was one of the more honest exchanges of the entire panel, precisely because it wasn't framed as advice-giving. It was two guards at different points in the same arc, talking about what it actually feels like to carry a high-performance standard while simultaneously being the person your team turns to when things stop working. Peterson is earlier in that journey. Clark is further along, and hearing them occupy those two positions in the same conversation without either of them performing wisdom or performing humility revealed something about how Clark thinks about mentorship that her answers to direct questions about it don't fully capture. Rose made the observation during the panel that before you can lead, you have to learn to follow, and that he had watched Clark do exactly that. What makes that observation land is that it wasn't offered as a compliment about her past. It was offered as an explanation of her present, of why the relationships she described with her teammates carry the specific texture they do, built on a foundation of having been the person watching and absorbing before she became the person others watch and absorb from. There is a version of Caitlyn Clark that the sports media has spent considerable energy constructing, composed, precise, press conference, ready, every word measured against the awareness that cameras are always present and narratives are always forming. That version is real. It exists because she built it deliberately, because the environment she operates in demands it, and because the discipline her father installed in her from childhood extends naturally into how she manages public-facing moments. But it is not the complete picture. And the FanFest crowd got to see that with a clarity that no scheduled media appearance could have produced. Jaylen Rose waved a young fan named Carson onto the stage mid-panel, without warning, without setup, without giving Clark any time to shift into a different mode. One moment, she was answering a question about basketball's role in youth development. The next, a kid was standing next to her in front of a live crowd and a room full of cameras. What happened in the following 2 minutes was not a performance of warmth. It was warmth, expressed by someone who didn't need to locate it or manufacture it because it was already the thing operating underneath everything else she had said that afternoon. She turned straight to Carson, asked him questions, took a photo with him, told him he needed to work on his shot, then immediately told Rose that Carson needed black socks with his outfit. The crowd lost itself in that moment, not because it was surprising that a famous athlete was being kind to a child, but because the kindness was so completely unself-conscious that it reframed everything the room had been watching for the previous hour. The discipline, the habits, the championship declarations, the careful language about roster culture, and winning all of it suddenly looked different when you saw it sitting next to this. Clark hadn't been performing professionalism for an hour and then dropped the mask when a kid walked up. The professionalism and the warmth came from the same place, built by the same people, sustained by the same daily choices. Carson didn't know he was walking into a documentary moment. Clark didn't treat it like one. And that gap between what the moment actually was and how completely she failed to make it about herself is the most accurate portrait of her that the entire panel produced. Rose had spent the afternoon asking her questions designed to surface who she really is. A kid in mismatched socks answered it more directly than any of them. Numbers in basketball are useful up to a point, and then they stop. They tell you how many shots went in, how many passes found the right hands, how many defensive possessions ended the way you needed them to. What they don't tell you is the texture of how a locker room changes when a certain kind of player walks into it. They don't capture the standard that gets set not through speeches or meetings, but through the simple, repeated act of someone showing up at a level that makes everyone around them recalibrate their own baseline. Caitlyn Clark's statistics across her college and professional career are the kind that generate headlines and arguments and comparison threads that run for hundreds of comments. But the thing Jaylen Rose kept returning to throughout the panel, the discipline, the professionalism, the way she respects teammates, the orientation toward winning as a collective outcome rather than an individual achievement, none of that lives in a stat line. It lives in the day-to-day experience of being around her, and the people who have that experience consistently describe it in terms that have nothing to do with points per game. Tamika Catchings framed it at the event in terms of character preceding performance. Rose framed it in terms of maturity arriving earlier than it typically does. Both of them were pointing at the same thing from different angles, that what Clark brings to a franchise extends considerably beyond what shows up in the box score after the final buzzer. What the numbers also don't capture is the specific kind of leadership she has developed, which operates almost entirely through example rather than declaration. She didn't arrive in Indianapolis announcing herself as a leader. She arrived as a rookie, watched the veterans, absorbed what they carried, and built her own standard in relationship to theirs rather than in opposition to them. That process, quiet, observational, genuinely humble in the functional rather than performative sense, is what Rose was describing when he told the crowd that the difference between players who develop into champions and players who spend careers adjacent to championships is often this exact quality: the willingness to learn from people who know things you don't, sustained past the point where your profile would technically allow you to stop. Clark is 24 years old. She is already one of the most recognizable athletes in American sports. And she still talked about Lexi Hull and Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell and Sophie Cunningham as people whose example she is actively measuring herself against. That combination, the platform of a superstar and the learning posture of someone still figuring it out, is not common. It is, in fact, precisely the thing that makes the next chapter of her career worth watching with genuine attention, rather than simply waiting for the highlights. When Jaylen Rose asked Caitlyn Clark what she still hoped to accomplish in her career, the room held itself in the particular way rooms do when they sense that the answer coming is going to be the one that defines the entire conversation. She didn't make them wait long, and she didn't dress it up. She is 24 years old. She has been to the finals. She has been to the semifinals. And what she wants next, stated with the calm certainty of someone reading a decision already made, rather than announcing an aspiration still being formed, is championships. Not one, a few. That word few landed in the room the way a well-placed pass lands in a crowded lane. Everyone felt it arrive before they fully processed why. It wasn't the ambition that surprised them. Players talk about wanting to win championships in every sport, at every level, constantly, and the words usually dissolve into the background noise of professional sports language. What made this different was the absence of anything performative around it. No build-up, no rhetorical framing, no pause to let the moment breathe. Just a number, stated plainly, by someone who had spent the previous hour demonstrating in considerable detail exactly why the number was not unreasonable. What separated that declaration from standard preseason championship talk was everything that had come before it in the same room on the same afternoon. The father who ran practice and sat across the dinner table and refused to let excuses travel anywhere useful. The decision to cut out fast food senior year, treated not as sacrifice, but as logic. The teammates she named Hull, Boston, Mitchell, Cunningham described not as people she has learned from, but as people she is still learning from. The injury layoff that didn't shake her certainty, but sharpened it, clarifying how much she needed the game and how specifically she intended to use the year she had left in it. All of it ran in one direction, and the championship declaration was simply where that direction pointed. Rose told the crowd that the difference between players who win titles and players who spend careers almost winning is the willingness to say it out loud and then go build it. Clark didn't flinch at that. She sat with it the way you sit with something you already know. The Indiana Fever opened 2026 with a player who has stated publicly, in front of a live crowd, that a few championships is the number she is working toward. Not as a hope, not as a goal written on a whiteboard in January that fades by March, as the logical conclusion of a blueprint that has been under construction since a coach who happened to be her father first held her to a standard she couldn't argue her way out of. The work is already happening. The number is already decided. What remains is simply the doing of it.